If Russian bots exist, do Chinese bots also exist? I think, first of all, you should look down at the comments in this video and you'll probably get a taste of whether there are any Chinese bots. I'm Michael Beckley. I study modern China. Let's answer your questions from the internet. This is China Support. S. Sheepherder wants to know, what do Westerners get wrong about China? Well, China's really big. There's 19 countries around China. And so that big military that China has is spread quite thin, having to defend all of China's borders. Or the big economy. You have to feed one of the largest populations on the planet. You have to maintain control over those people. That all drains resources from the country and means just that it's much more complicated to analyze China. You have both a lot of assets, but also a lot of liabilities. At Snow Lions wants to know, when did modern China start? Let's answer that with a timeline. Let's start in 1911 with the collapse of the Qing dynasty that ends thousands of years off and on of imperial rule. China then collapses into the warlord era, which is every bit as bad as it sounds. Then the Japanese in the 1930s really step up their aggression in China, conquering big parts of it and basically starting World War II in East Asia. The Japanese are defeated in 1945, but at that point the Chinese Civil War comes roaring back between the communists and the nationalists. The communists win that civil war in 1949. They found the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. China initially sides with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but about halfway through they realize that the Soviets are actually their main enemy. That paves the way for the US president, Richard Nixon, to go to Beijing, and at that point China and the United States basically become allies in the rest of the Cold War. The Soviet Union collapses in 1991, and that sets the stage for the US and China to become major trading and investment partners. That culminates in 2001 with China's entry into the World Trade Organization. But especially after the 2008 financial crisis, you start to see the United States and China looking at each other more like rivals, feeling like their economies are under strain and that the trade relationship is not working out as well as they had hoped. And that really paves the way for the era that we're currently in, which is one of tremendous hostility between the United States and China. Hecubus asks, why would China even want to invade Taiwan? So first of all, Taiwan is the seat of a rival Chinese government that is democratic, essentially tied security-wise to the United States. And so if you're the Chinese Communist Party and you insist that this is all your territory, you can't have this renegade regime going in a different direction. Taiwan is where the nationalists fled to when they lost the Chinese Civil War. So they want to finish that job. It's smack dab at the epicenter of the East China Sea and the South China Sea, where about half of world trade flows through. So this is probably pound for pound the most strategic, important waterway on the planet. And Taiwan itself is, you can see, the center cork of what the Chinese call the first island chain in East Asia. That runs from Korea and the Japanese islands down through the Philippines. These are all American allies. They host American troops. China has no California. It has no West Coast. Its only coast is completely hemmed in by rival powers that are allied with the United States. Smashing Taiwan and taking it over would give China an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the most important waterways and blast a hole, not just geographically in the U.S. alliance system in East Asia, but really in the credibility of U.S. alliances, because no one would trust the United States if the U.S. just let Taiwan go down. Every single Chinese leader has said it's only a question of time. We're going to take Taiwan one of these days. Xi Jinping has said that it's a situation that cannot be passed down generation to generation, which some analysts worry means he intends to do this on his watch. BW asks, is there something America can learn from China? Is there something that they're doing right? China is really good at mobilizing resources for national missions. For example, China has installed more solar and wind power than any other country. China is the world's largest trade power in the world and has forged trade relationships with a majority of the world's countries. And China has built infrastructure faster and on greater scale than any country in human history. And just the miraculous development of bringing hundreds of millions of people from living on less than $2 a day to average disposable incomes of $5,000 to $10,000 a year, that is a tremendous, almost miraculous undertaking that China has been able to pull off. And I think that only comes from having a sense of national unity and a willingness to pool resources for national purposes. The United States it's a dynamic, open, decentralized system, but the downside is it also generally does not mobilize its resources on a national scale and unify unless it's really confronted with a crisis like a global war or a depression. So there are areas of the United States that are neglected in terms of infrastructure. There are neighborhoods that could be built up. There are education systems that are failing. And so that type of rallying resources and coming together is something that the U.S. I think could look to China. But obviously you don't want to go too far because part of what allows China to do that is just a lack of civil and political rights for the Chinese people. At Great Historian asks, who is winning the current trade war between America and China? China is very much an investment and export-driven economy. This trade war is really bad for a lot of those major export industries. There's been lots of closures, especially in eastern China. There's been mass layoffs, even just in the short time that this trade war has been going on. Now, on the American side, the consumer market is roughly 3 times the size of China's. So consumers are the ones who are being hurt by this trade war because they're going to have to pay higher prices for goods that were manufactured in China. Xi Jinping cares a lot less about GDP growth. He cares about power and about developing self-reliant, strong industries. And if this trade war enables China to decouple and reduce its dependence on the West, I think he counts that as a win, even if it crimps economic growth in the short term. And for the United States under the Trump administration, they similarly want to decouple from China because they view it as a national security threat. I see these two countries as having a distinct interest in trying to get away from each other economically. These dependencies, they both seem to want to push those away. Chase the Taco. Serious question. Is China truly a communist country? I know it seems crazy. You look at the Shanghai skyline, you fly in through the Beijing airport. That is the gilded veneer on the outside that's been built up. But if you look at the superstructure of the economy, what's actually the driving force behind it, it's a very strong state presence. All of the land in the country is owned by the Chinese Communist Party. The energy industry, the banking sector is state-owned. 90+% of the financial assets flowing around the country. So these are all what Lenin called the commanding heights of the economy. And it can produce incredible output. It can produce shiny high-speed rail. It can produce gleaming skyscrapers. But this is sort of like a new modern form of a communist system where you still have the party running the show economically, insisting on a one-party state and a dictator ruling over it all. Take Jack Ma, the former head of Alibaba, a major company in China. He gave a speech a few years back criticizing the way that the government was running the economy. He had his wings totally clipped. He was sent out to Tokyo. He had his empire completely dismantled and now has basically had to come crawling back. You've had many other billionaires simply just disappear. And so at the end of the day, even the high-flying titans of China's economy know that their livelihoods depend very much on their relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, which is why you see many of the top titans of industry in China in the National People's Hall during these major conclaves sitting next to Xi Jinping because they are effectively part of the same party system that he operates. Dizzy Major 5 wants to know, what do the Chinese people think of Mao Zedong? Is he considered good or bad? The standard answer taught in Chinese schools is that he was 70% right, but 30% wrong. Here's Mao as a young revolutionary. He was a journalist for a long time. He actually wrote a whole pamphlet in 1940 about democracy and freedom in China. Of course, once he becomes Chairman Mao, a lot of that stuff goes away. The 70% right was he unified the country, which had been ripped apart by decades of civil war. He instituted a mass education campaign because he wanted to lift China up, so that led to widespread literacy. He wanted women to be active participants in the labor force. Now, in terms of the bad, his so-called Great Leap Forward, which was this scheme to turn China into a superpower in just a few years, took millions of peasants off of their farms, put them in communes, had them melt down their pots and pans. As a result, the food supply ran out and 45 million people starved to death or were beaten or shot along the way. And then in order to insulate and protect himself, he then launched the Cultural Revolution, where he basically turned the Chinese people on the Communist Party to purge many of his rivals. That probably killed another 1 million to 2 million people. So ruthless, brutal, but effective in terms of bringing China together, which for much of Chinese history has not been the case. At Supercoach137 asks, how did the one-child policy work out for China? It resulted in several hundred million abortions when people starting in the late 1970s weren't allowed to have more than one child. You'd be subject to massive fines, equivalent in some cases to a year or more of your income if you had a second child. In the 50s and 60s, China had a massive baby boom because Mao Zedong wanted to turn China into a superpower, so he encouraged Chinese families to have lots of children. So then when China did a 180 1980 and implemented the one-child policy in the late 1970s, you had this baby boom generation coming into the prime of their working lives, and they had relatively few children to take care of because they weren't allowed to have them. And they had relatively few elderly parents to care for because so many of them end up dying in the famines and the Cultural Revolution. So in the 90s and 2000s, you had anywhere between 10 to 15 working age adults available to support every elderly retiree in China's population. That's 2 to 3 times the global average. It's 5 times what the United States currently has. And so as a result, China's population was primed for economic productivity, and demographers think that alone explains about 25% of China's rapid economic growth over the last 30 to 40 years. The problem for China is now the situation is flipping, where that huge baby boom generation are retiring and falling onto the backs of this tiny one-child generation. That 10 to 15 ratio is going to collapse to 2 to 1 in the 2030s. China's going to lose somewhere like 70 million working-age adults in the next 10 years and gain 130 million senior citizens. That's going to be catastrophic for China's fiscal balance, for its economic productivity. At right side of MB says, Siri, what are Chinese ghost cities? Ghost cities refer to entire apartment complexes, airports, shopping malls that are either mostly or entirely empty. And it's a result of China's economic model, which is very much about collecting the resources of the Chinese people under the state and then plowing them into certain industries, including into the real estate sector. It works really well for an authoritarian government because it's easy to pay off cronies who own the companies that are doing all of the building. The problem is it runs amok. These companies, they're getting paid whether the apartments are occupied or not. So they build a bunch of stuff, but then people aren't moving into them. And now that China's population is declining, there is going to be ever lowering demand for a lot of this base infrastructure. Mehmet Topal wants to know, how much power does Xi Jinping hold personally? Is he an absolutist like Louis XIV or like Stalin? I'm going to reserve a certain category for divine right monarchs like Louis XIV and distinguish that from Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping is probably the most powerful leader since Mao Zedong. He's made himself president of everything for life, but at the end of the day, he's one guy. And so his ability to pay attention to everything that's going on in his vast, sprawling country is inherently limited. So the real estate crisis that's going on. He's demanded that people be more frugal and not speculate on real estate. But the market is kind of doing what it's going to do. And as a result, you still have that ongoing crisis. Zero COVID, he locked down Chinese people in their apartments for months on end. At a certain point, the Chinese people had it, and you saw protests emerging that seemed to have encouraged Xi to back down and undo that policy. And he also has to worry about rivals in the party, which is why he's embarked on this massive anti-corruption campaign, purging more than 1 million senior CCP officials along the way. We do know a bit about his backstory. His father was a high-ranking official serving under Mao Zedong, but he was purged. And in fact, Xi himself and his family were purged during the Cultural Revolution. Xi was sent out to the countryside to basically dig a bunch of holes. His father was humiliated. Xi himself was denounced by his own mother, and his half-sister died during the Cultural Revolution. It's all speculation, but people think this may have had a big effect on him, and that's what he thinks of when he thinks of rule by the people, which may explain partially why he seems so committed to centralizing all power under himself and basically installing himself to the point that he's literally written himself into the Constitution and obligates other people in China to read what he calls Xi Jinping thought, which is his own sort of philosophy about how to guide the country. At Nick Moneypenny wants to know, what was China's ultimate role in the COVID-19 pandemic? We don't know for sure because China, the government has gone to extraordinary lengths to cover up how COVID emerged and details about the virus. We know that in late 2019, they basically got rid of a lot of their virus samples that were related to coronaviruses. They floated conspiracy theories that the virus actually came to China from frozen food that was imported from outside of the country. And they didn't really allow international inspectors until very late. And even then, when the WHO came to try to figure out where the virus came from, it was a highly scripted, almost sort of like North Korean tour around the facilities. And as a result, we just don't know where it came from. The two major theories are that it either emerged from this wet market in Wuhan because of the animals that were being eaten and slaughtered there. The other major theory is that it emerged from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is China's premier place for studying coronaviruses. And we know know the virus itself has certain features that you really only see if it's been modified in a lab rather than naturally. The bottom line is we don't know, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that it was done in this lab, which is a center of not just Chinese research, but of a multinational research attempt to analyze coronaviruses. At Jerry Dunleavy asks, whatever happened to Tank Man, and how many people did the Chinese Communist Party murder at Tiananmen Square? So what Jerry is referring to is that famous image of a man standing in front of several tanks that are rolling into Tiananmen Square to run over demonstrators, mainly students that were protesting there in 1989. We have no idea what happened to Tank Man. He's never been heard of since. It wasn't just a crackdown in Beijing and Tiananmen Square. There were massive protests in basically every provincial capital around China. More than 80 cities had mass demonstrations that were then forcibly put down. According to the party, roughly 200 to 300 people were killed, but most Western estimates suggest it was 10 times that amount. The way that the Tiananmen Square protests are often portrayed is as a pro-democracy demonstration by the Chinese people, and certainly there were elements of that. A lot of the students in Tiananmen Square were calling for more democratic governance. They built a giant replica of the Statue of Liberty in the middle of Tiananmen Square. But really the crisis starts, and the reason why it spreads across the country was economic. There was massive inflation. This led to massive demonstrations. A lot of people weren't being paid for jobs that they were employed to do by the state. And also keep in mind that communist regimes were starting to crumble, especially across Eastern Europe. So the tail end of the Cold War and this belief that the legitimacy, the functioning of a communist system is under question and led to mass demonstrations and even a split among the elites in the Chinese Communist Party. Since then, now the Communist Party is very much, we have to stay together. We either stay together or we hang separately. I think that informs a lot of the emphasis on repression put on in China today. Milton Merlo XD wants to know, how does censorship work in China? So there's an actual propaganda department, that's what it's called in China. They set guidelines about what is allowed to be said and what is not allowed to be said. It's all pretty predictable, criticizing the Chinese Communist Party, promoting democracy, Western liberal methods are all kind of looked down upon and squelched. What the regime then does is they have this vast, great firewall to control the internet, where they use a combination of artificial intelligence and then hundreds of thousands of people that are actually working to monitor China's internet, which is partially sealed off. What the censors really go after is not so much people going off and mouthing criticism about the leader, but much more about trying to organize politically, whether it's a house church or a student group or anything where you get people together who can then talk and then rally and potentially grow their numbers. That looks too much like the start of an alternative political party. And the Chinese Communist Party says, no, we have a monopoly on power. We're the only political party that's allowed to be had in this system, and that seems to be what the censorship regime is primarily dedicated to squelching out. At M. Bateman says, wait, China's domestic surveillance system is actually called Skynet? I know it's kind of on the nose. It is called Skynet. The idea is that there's hundreds of millions of surveillance cameras that have been set up around the country as if it's a net coming from the sky. China has pioneered methods to take all of the images that are being absorbed by these cameras and then use artificial intelligence and speech and facial recognition technology, even gait recognition. So how you walk can be identified. And at this point, they are starting to export elements of this system to more than 80 countries. Cuba, Pakistan, Cambodia have all imported aspects of this system. And so some scholars think this is the emergence of a new type of authoritarian system that seems to have a lot of advantages in terms of population control. At Spencimo C asks, how does China's social credit system work? So in addition to video cameras and speech and facial recognition technology, the Communist Party has access to your financial statements, to your police record, your education, any kind of disciplinary action. And so what they've done is basically created a dossier on every single citizen. And so what they can then do is instantly punish Chinese citizens by saying, oh, you jaywalked, that's a point, and so now you're gonna have to pay more if you want a loan, or you may not be able to travel as freely, or it may take longer to get your passport when you go to a government office. There essentially is like a score, and sometimes they will actually post names of people who have been blacklisted because they've committed certain crimes or they've been in infraction of certain regulations, encouraging people to report on each other. It's All Over Again wants to know, why is China so godlike in the world of manufacturing? Well, it's so godlike because it's designed to be godlike. You have an authoritarian system that essentially obligates the Chinese people to put their life savings in a state-owned bank. That means the government has tons of money, a war chest that they can then deploy at what they call strategic industries. So they've spent hundreds of billions of dollars every single year for more than a decade. That's 10 times what other rich countries countries in the OECD or the United States spend as a share of their GDPs. So in, for example, the electric vehicle sector, China has spent about $230 billion, semiconductors, biotechnology, all of these key strategic industries. And at the same time, many foreign companies have sent over lots of investment and training. So Apple, for example, has spent about $275 billion in investment in China. That's more than the Marshall Plan that the United States used to help Europe recover from World War II. Apple also trained millions of Chinese workers, 28 million, which is more than the labor force of California. And also a lot of this is determined by their geography. China has a long coastline right in the heart of East Asia, which is the most economically dynamic region in the world. So many of the world's supply chains flow through these waters. In the 1970s and early 1980s, you had China setting up what they called special economic zones, especially in the southeast, in places like Shenzhen, as well as in Fujian province. In some industries, whether it's electric vehicles or in rare earths, China currently produces anywhere between 60 to 90% of the global market. And now China has ports lining up and down its coastline that serve as export platforms essentially for the rest of the world. In addition, China has extremely low labor costs because several hundred million people from the poorer provinces in the West, they move to the richer East Coast provinces to work in factories for very low wages, but that provides essentially a bottomless source of cheap but effective labor for China's manufacturing juggernaut. Roxy USA asks, what percentage of pharmaceuticals does the U.S. import in from China? In terms of antibiotics, basic antibiotics, it's upwards of 90% that include at least some ingredients that are made in China. And so this has become another national security threat where the United States worries that China could potentially cut the United States off from basic pharmaceuticals if there's some kind of crisis over Taiwan. Whether China would actually do that remains to be seen. At Toxic Cowboy 1 asks, are we headed to war with China? It's not completely out of the question. In addition to the conflict over Taiwan, there's also the risk of a war around the Philippines. That conflict really stems over who controls the South China Sea, where a lot of trade passes through, where most of China's oil imports pass through. Under international law, the Philippines gets 12 miles out from their coastline that is their territory, and then another 200 miles out from their coastline that is their exclusive economic zone. China says, no, that's just all Chinese territory, and they've been building artificial islands there, they've been turning them into military bases, and they formed what they call a maritime militia, so thousands of fishing boats, Coast Guard vessels, and naval ships that are basically shoving other countries out of their exclusive economic zone and confining them to narrow bands along their own coastlines. The Philippines took China to court in 2016, the World Court, which ruled that China's historical claims to the South China Sea are null and void. And in recent years, China's really been turning the screw on the Philippines. One, I think, to invalidate that ruling and shatter its credibility. But second, because the Philippines has started opening up new military bases for the United States because they say, we need some protection from China so that we can have access to our territorial waters in our exclusive economic zone. The Chinese have a saying, you should kill a chicken to scare the monkeys, meaning you should make a bloody example out of a relatively weak adversary to send a message to the more powerful ones. The Philippines have very little offensive air or naval capability, so you just have to worry that Chinese would look at them as a very juicy target. Weak, but symbolically important. At Adam Check asks, is TikTok just a China app to make Americans do dumb stuff to get likes and views and keep us distracted while they take over? The Chinese version of TikTok, you're only allowed to use it for 15 minutes to an hour or so, depending on your age and status. And they also try to insert educational, wholesome content in addition to all the fun cat videos and everything else that people are watching. So I think the Chinese know that this system is maybe not the best thing that kids should be spending all day on. TikTok is owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company. Under Chinese law, ByteDance is required to hand over data to Beijing whenever and in however much it wants it. It's like putting a Chinese spy balloon in your cell phone with your biometric data, everything you've liked and disliked. There's been studies done suggesting that the algorithm in TikTok in the American version was promoting certain views, like after the October 7th massacre in Israel, more pro-Hamas views were being amplified or pro-Russian views on the Ukraine conflict. At NOYK1847 asks, if Russian bots exist, do Chinese bots also exist? I think, first of all, you should look down at the comments in this video and you'll probably get a taste of whether there are any Chinese bots. China, it's been well documented, uses both bots as well as what is called a 50-cent army. Basically, it's a bunch of mainly kids and young adults who are paid 50 Chinese cents per internet post that they make to destroy, undermine the credibility of messages that maybe cut against the Chinese Communist Party. It's reported there's probably several 100,000 people that are essentially employed as internet trolls by the Chinese Communist Party, in addition to obviously using artificial intelligence and bots. At Psalm69 asks, why would China want Tibet? I think it becomes very clear when you look at a map of China. You can see that most of it is the highest mountains in the world, the Himalayas, and a lot of it is also desert. And so most of China's population is packed in here, and they're desperate for water, as well as strategic space to defend themselves against enemies. And so Tibet, which is in this area here, is highly strategic. For one, a lot of the glaciers up in the Himalayas are where the major rivers of Asia start, both flowing down into China, as well as flowing down into Southeast Asia and into India. So if China can control that territory, it controls the source of vital water supplies. At the same time, China and India, which is now the most populous country on the planet, have a long-standing rivalry, and Tibet is the high ground, literally looking down onto India. In addition, the Chinese Communist Party essentially inherited the borders of the previous Qing dynasty empire, which included Tibet, led by the Dalai Lama. And so when China took over Tibet and conquered it in 1951, the Dalai Lama fled to India and has been running a government in exile in India ever since. This next question is from Tapestry Girl. Mom says China could take over the United States because they own our debt. China does own some U.S. debt. It's in the 3 to 4% range. It topped out at about 7% about a decade ago, generally in the form of treasury bills. And a lot of this emerges just from the economic relationship between the United States and China, where China is exporting a lot of goods to the United States, and the United States will often pay for that essentially with a piece of paper that says IOU in the form of a treasury bill. Analysts have looked at whether they could use this as a coercive weapon and basically concluded they'd be shooting themselves in the foot. The value of that asset would suddenly plummet. Japan owns more U.S. debt than China does, so I don't think that this is a unique China thing or that they could use it as some type of weapon to coerce the United States. Let's take a question from Cora. Is modern China more influenced by Confucianism or Marxism? I would say both, because they lead in similar directions. Marxism-Leninism stresses the idea of public or communal ownership of the means of production to produce wealth. That is owned by the state in China. It's led by what Lenin would call the vanguard party, staffed by a top leader that is making decisions on behalf of the people. And that's consistent with certain elements of Confucianism. Confucianism obviously has a long lineage, thousands of years in China. Confucius, a philosopher who emphasized a natural harmony, people knowing their place in society, that everyone has a certain role to perform in that society, and that you have to have a benevolent leader that leads on behalf of the people. That obviously appeals very much to Chinese dynasties over the millennia. You have Xi Jinping today grafting that onto a Marxist-Leninist structure of the party. At Gus802 asks, what happened with the Chinese spy balloon hysteria? In January 2023, the United States detected a balloon floating over areas, including a nuclear missile silo in Montana. What it was carrying was all this advanced surveillance equipment that was about the size of a regional jet airliner. So we're talking about a major piece of hardware floating around. China's done this in more than 40 countries. In Japan, over Taiwan, they've been floating balloons, even potentially over American bases in Europe. And there's a fear that China is testing out this alternative surveillance system because balloons emit almost no radar signature. They're really hard to detect. They hover around 60,000 feet, which is higher than a commercial airliner, but below satellites in this area where people really aren't looking. It gives China eyes and ears over sensitive U.S. sites that otherwise they wouldn't have. The U.S. sent a fighter jet up eventually to shoot it down, and then the U.S. grabbed all of the technology that was there and observed the balloon's flight. That might have actually helped U.S. intelligence more than Chinese intelligence. At All Four Stops asks, who is winning the tech war between China and the United States? I think they are each dominating different types of technologies. The United States is still doing quite well in high-value areas, so advanced computer chips, aerospace, the complicated jet engines that you need to fly a jumbo jet or a fighter. China, on the other hand, dominates scale, taking existing technologies from from other countries and then mass producing highly effective, cost-efficient electric vehicles, run-of-the-mill computer chips, rare earths, pharmaceuticals, medical PPE. There's so many areas where China can just flood the market with sheer scale. Both of those types of technologies are really important for a modern economy. They're also very important for military power. So each in their own way is sort of winning in some ways, but also has major vulnerabilities. At Joe Bart 85120716 asks, does China own American farmland? Yes, China does own American farmland. It's like 0.05% of American farmland, but some of this farmland is near American military bases, especially Air Force bases, including some of those where American strategic forces, nuclear forces, could be taking off. And so there is a fear that if China has this land, they can put things on it, explosives, missiles that could potentially attack American bases if there is some kind of major war and destroy U.S. aircraft on the ground before they even get up into the air. We don't know the details on that. You'd have to get classified information, but the amount of farmland is small. The location is a bit scary and questionable. Cakebot asks, can someone explain Hong Kong to me? So Hong Kong was a British colony after the first Opium War in 1839, all the way up until 1997, where Britain agreed to hand back Hong Kong to China, and in exchange, China pledged to grant Hong Kong a, quote, high degree of autonomy. Because within Hong Kong, there was a different rule of law. There was an independent judiciary. So you saw massive protests there over the last 5 or 6 years when China was basically trying to erode a lot of those freedoms, crack down on the press, crack down on the free flow of investment, and also on the way that the Hong Kong government is selected. The Chinese government passed national security laws that made it possible for them to remove protesters, take them to mainland China. So at this point, it seems like Hong Kong has basically become another large cosmopolitan but ultimately Chinese city run by the Chinese Communist Party. Iron Lover 64 asks, how does the quality of life for the low class in China compare to that of the United States, let's say in a red state? So why don't we compare the poorest of the poor in China to, say, average wages in Mississippi, which is the poorest state. For China, roughly half the country is living on something like $5 to $10 a day. In Mississippi, that's going to be 3 to 4 times that amount. There's a lot more obesity in a place like Mississippi than there is in China. On the other hand, in rural China, you have a severe problem of malnourishment and rudimentary healthcare. Researchers at Stanford went out and they found that roughly a third of rural children, their IQs are around 90, which is really low because of malnutrition from a young age, a lack of education. The average education level is about an 8th grade or 7th grade level in rural China because high school costs money. And so a lot of Chinese families, their kids will just drop out of school. And the other issue is that your citizenship in China is tied to your locality. And so if mom and dad go to an eastern rich coastal province to work in a factory, they can't bring their kids with them because they won't be allowed to go to school. So they're just sending money back and maybe only seeing their kids a few times or maybe only once a year. So just in terms of the basic healthcare and education level, and then just in terms of the amount of wealth that someone in Mississippi might have versus someone in poor rural China, it's a very stark difference. At Captain Trips 333 asks, what's going on with the Uyghur Muslim population in China? So there's about 10 to 12 million Uyghur Muslims. They live mainly in a province called Xinjiang, which is in the western part of China. Basically, since 2017, China set up what they call re-education centers or vocational education centers, what people in the West have called concentration camps, and what the U.S. government deems an attempt at genocide, and basically put in 1 million to 1.5 million Uyghur Muslims, so a substantial part of the population in these centers. We've heard from people that have come out of them that there's a lot of indoctrination, that they are enforced to renounce their heritage and to learn Mandarin and basically to assimilate with Chinese society. A big part of what the Chinese Communist Party is about is making sure a Soviet-style collapse never occurs in China. And one of their theories about why the Soviet Union broke apart was that the Soviet Union was like one of those Hershey chocolate bars that's divided into little squares that you can break apart. It was these disparate republics that all went their own way when they suddenly could. So there was a fear that a minority region like Xinjiang, where these Uyghurs were living, was going to try to separate from the mainland or was going to become a base of terrorism directed at China. So unfortunately, the Uyghur Muslims are experiencing severe repression right now under the Chinese Communist Party. Lo Farafale asks, does China support or promote communism around the world? I don't think China is promoting communism anymore the way that the Soviet Union used to bankroll revolutionary movements. They have engaged in this Belt and Road initiative where they've loaned out more than $1 trillion to more than 100 different countries, mainly so that those countries can employ Chinese companies to build infrastructure on their territory. So whether that's building ports or roads or soccer stadiums or what the Chinese call smart city systems. There's a port in Greece, for example, that is highly profitable. It's an important, valuable piece of infrastructure that China helped fund and build. 1 out of every 3 infrastructure projects in sub-Saharan Africa over the last 20 years has been built partially or entirely by Chinese companies. So you see a massive spread of infrastructure. And part of the reason really stems from the 2008 financial crisis and the resulting trade protectionism that was emerging, backlash against Chinese products. The Chinese decided we need to open up new markets. We can also get these countries more hooked on our ecosystem of technology standards, 5G networks, smart city systems, and that way we'll have dominant market share in a lot of these areas that are going to be really the growth of demand in terms of consumption going forward. They also bring that surveillance system that allows would-be dictators to keep easier tabs on their populations. At Ostinati asks, what happens when Xi dies? Who's next in line, and will they be good for China? I think chaos could potentially ensue because he has not designated a successor. He's written himself into the constitution. He's basically treated like a demigod in terms of Chinese propaganda. And if you look at the history of the Chinese Communist Party, there has only been one completely orderly and peaceful transition of power, and that's when Xi himself came to power. All of the previous leaders, it was a vicious power struggle and there was split authorities. So for example, Deng Xiaoping is purged and then eventually comes back to power and has to put down his enemies and imprison them in order to take the helm. Then Jiang Zemin comes to power after the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989, basically because the party realizes it needs to unify behind a candidate or they're just going to disintegrate. Then when Hu Jintao comes to power, Jiang Zemin is not willing to give up a lot of his power, and he keeps himself as commander-in-chief even after Hu Jintao becomes president and general secretary of the country. It'd be like as if Joe Biden was still head of the Pentagon and the military and commander-in-chief, even though Donald Trump is now president here in the United States. In other words, in Chinese politics, it's very rough and tumble, even though it happens behind closed doors. Chaos is entirely possible, and if you just look at the broad sweep of Chinese history, vicious power struggles tend to ensue. Some people hope that you'll get a Chinese Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader who made nice with the West and liberalized a bit at home. I think you might actually get a Chinese Vladimir Putin. It seems like the one thing that everyone in the Chinese Communist Party can agree on is that the Chinese Communist Party should continue to rule China in perpetuity. So those are all the questions for today. Thanks for watching China Support.